Good afternoon, and welcome to the Kennedy Presidential Library, where we think that President's Day is the most important day of the year. I'm Deborah Leff. I'm director of the Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and on behalf of myself and John Shattuck, who's CEO of the Kennedy Library Foundation, it's wonderful to have such a full house here to join us in a look at three recent American presidents who substantially changed this country, offering very different governing styles and very different views of the world. I want to thank our forum sponsors, our lead sponsor, the Bank of America, and the Lowell Institute, Corcoran Jennison, and Boston Capital, as well as our media sponsors, WBUR, Boston.com, and the Boston Globe, which gives us a wonderful moderator today. You can look at any president and see how he ages over the course of his term, and you realize that the presidency is one tough job. But as President Kennedy often noted, it is also a job that meets the definition of happiness of the Greeks. It is the full use of your powers along lines of excellence. President Kennedy stated that by that definition, he found that the presidency provides some happiness. How much did he like the job? That's a question that President Kennedy faced during his press conference on March 29th. 1962. Let's watch.
Mr. President, your brother Ted recently on television said that after seeing the cares of office on you that he wasn't sure he'd ever be interested in being the president. I wonder if you could tell us whether, if you had it to do over again, you would work for the presidency and whether you can recommend the job to others.
Well, the answer is the first is yes, and the second is no. I don't recommend it to others, at least for a while.
It's an honor to have with us today the man who Philip Seib in the Dallas Morning News called one of the best political biographers, as well as one of America's finest political reporters. As Seib noted, his books about John Kennedy, Richard Nixon, and now Ronald Reagan are indispensable reading for anyone interested in the modern U.S. presidency. The biographer, of course, is Richard Reeves, whose weekly column has appeared since 1979 in more than 100 newspapers. He has been chief political correspondent for the New York Times and a columnist for both Esquire and New York Magazine. He has been both a Pulitzer Prize finalist and a Pulitzer Prize juror. He's chief correspondent for PBS's Frontline, and his remarkable television documentaries have won the hat trick of broadcast journalism awards, the Emmy, the Peabody, and the Columbia DuPont Awards. At the Kennedy Library here, we admire him for his biography, President Kennedy, Profile and Power, which was named the best nonfiction book of 1993 by Time Magazine, and Book of the Year by Washington Monthly. I also note with great pride that we have Richard Reeves' papers among our archives. A few years ago, we welcomed Mr. Reeves to the library to talk about his fascinating book, President Nixon, Alone in the White House. And today, it is a real pleasure to have him back to discuss these books, along with his newest biography, President Reagan, The Triumph of Imagination. As the Sunday New York Times Book Review wrote a few weeks ago, President Reagan is a compelling read, fast-paced and scrupulously fair. The account of the Iran-Contra affair is particularly gripping. Anyone who is interested in Reagan's extraordinary presidency needs to reckon with Reeves. And to reckon with Reeves today, and to talk about Presidents Kennedy, Nixon, and Reagan, it is a pleasure to welcome back to the Kennedy Presidential Library Mark Feeney, a reporter, editor, and reviewer at the Boston Globe since 1979. Mr. Feeney is the author of Nixon at the Movies, a book about belief. He is also a lecturer in the American Studies Department at Brandeis University. After today's forum, Mr. Reeves will be signing his books in our museum store, and we encourage you to visit there and our museum and learn some more history on President's Day. Please join me in welcoming Richard Reeves and Mark Feeney.
I will clap for you, certainly. Before I begin asking Dick questions, I'd like to ask a question of the audience.
And I'm wondering if the lights could come down just for a moment for my asking that question. Is that possible? Whoever is that? Thank you. All right. I don't want to embarrass anyone, so I would ask everybody in the audience if he or she could close his or her eyes. Has everybody closed their eyes? Now then, all of you who have voted for Ronald Reagan, please raise your right hand. That's about what I would have expected. Say about 20.
Hard to believe how he won.
And this is Massachusetts, where he did win in 80 and 84. The first question. What did you find most surprising about Ronald Reagan? He's a man that you were acquainted with for many years before he became president. You covered his presidency. What surprised you in your research for the book?
I think two things did. One is that I learned what it was like to be old. That old men, which was very important to me, that old men are different than younger men. That the most striking differences between him and Kennedy and Nixon was the way people act at various times in their age. The second thing that it's better? Okay? Is that the whole idea that Ronald Reagan was a passive man is ludicrous. I mean, and I had kind of accepted the stories about passivity, the stories about being manipulated by other people, and I'll end the answer where we can talk more about it. He won the presidency on his third try. The citizen politician called forward by the public. Within 6 months of being elected governor of California, he was running for president in 1968 and might have won. In 1976, he committed the most aggressive act that an American politician can commit, which is to run against a sitting incumbent president of your own party when you ran against Jerry Ford in 1976. So that the Reagan I found that I, had half expected to find dozing in the corner, in fact, was this incredibly ambitious, bold gambler.
Well, you talked to Donald Reagan, a Cambridge boy, who was Reagan's second chief of staff, and asked him what was the biggest problem in the White House when Reagan was running it. And Reagan said, everyone there thought he was smarter than the president. And you said, including you? And Reagan said, including me.
Especially me.
Yeah. Can you talk a bit about Reagan's, as opposed to Reagan's intelligence and the deceptiveness of it?
Well, Reagan obviously was not... is it this?
I think it's this one, yeah.
Yeah. Can you hear me better? No, I don't hear myself. I can't hear myself. My wife would love it. Now how are we doing? No?
This one's on. I think that one isn't on.
How are we doing now?
No, it's still just you.
Yeah. It's not on.
Yeah. Shall we switch this over?
Well, I don't want to shortchange.
That's all right. They're here for you,
Right.
not for me.
Now, yeah. To sum up the last couple of minutes, I said Reagan was no passive guy. This was one tough guy who did what he wanted. Mark quoted Don Regan when I asked him what was the biggest problem in the White House, and that was that everyone thought they were smarter than the president, and certainly Don Regan did. To begin with, it doesn't. The presidency is not about IQ. If there were, there'd be statues of Herbert Hoover and Jimmy Carter and Nixon and Bill Clinton all over the country, who probably had the highest IQs of modern presidents, and we don't pay them by the hour, so working very hard is not the secret, as Jimmy Carter proved. The presidency is about judgment. It's about one or two or three big decisions, judgments a president makes in his own way. No one remembers what Lincoln's agricultural policy was, and no one will remember Reagan's either, except the farmers who kept getting more and more money. Hopefully they were corporations, really. But Ronald Reagan, the secret of Ronald Reagan's intelligence, I think, was that though he was no intellectual, he was a man of ideas. He had studied the ideas. He had always read. He was a reader his whole life, and he had studied the ideas. The great written influences on him were Russell Kirk and Hayek and Whittaker Chambers, who were among important conservative thinkers. And he had come to his own conclusions about how the world worked. And he had also come to an age where he wasn't going to learn anything new, and didn't intend to, didn't want to, quite different than Nixon and Kennedy, who were younger men who wanted to know everything, control everything, who cared a great deal about what people were saying about them. Most of that was not of great interest to Reagan. He once told Ed Rollins, who managed his 1984 campaign, "What should I care about history for? They'll get it wrong, and whether they get it right or wrong, I'll be dead." So that I think the secret to his decision making and his integrity, in the sense of being a man of consistency, was really his age. He had the intelligence and the energy of an old man. He conserved his energy, used it only when something interested him, and only four things really interested him. Those were cutting taxes to try to cut down the role of government, confronting the Soviet Union rather than containing it, rebuilding America's pride in itself, perhaps a little too much, and doubling the size of the military. And 3 out of the 4 things, forget the taxes and the deficits, he did accomplish.
Part of what, is this working? Yeah. Part of what let him accomplish that was an act of complete happenstance.
The shooting.
The shooting. We're coming up on the 25th anniversary of that. Can you talk a bit about the impact of that? And also, it's always fun to speculate. What might have happened had John Hinckley not been there outside the hotel that day?
Well, right. I think the question should be, what would have happened if he killed him?
Well, I think the President's Day, we celebrate. We can let's take it both ways. What if he had died?
And
also, I mean, my recollection was that he was beginning to run out of steam come the end of March 1981. Events were beginning to catch up with him, and the whole equation was changed by his truly heroic response to what had happened.
Well, he obviously, yes, he was a man of physical courage, as he proved. When Tip O'Neill, one thing you have to know, and one thing that's important to this book, 2 things. One is that Reagan almost died, and most of what we were told at the time was a lie about his health and what had happened to him. And the second thing was that he became a legend at the beginning of his presidency. And those 2 things come together when the first outsider was allowed to see him, and that was Tip O'Neill. Only family and staff had seen Reagan for the first 3 or 4 or 5 days after the shooting. And Reagan had reacted with great courage. The pictures of him, he thought he had broken ribs, but there was already blood bubbling out of his mouth. which meant his lungs had been punctured, even if that was it, which was why they turned the motorcade from the White House to GW Hospital, which was 5 blocks down Pennsylvania Avenue. And they were going to carry him into the hospital, and he shook them off as well as he could. He had already lost half his blood. He shook them off as well as a 70-year-old man. He shook them off as well as he could and walked the 20 yards into the emergency room, whereupon he collapsed. And the last words he heard were Jerry Parr, the head of a Secret Service delegation, saying, "My God, we've lost him." And he then passed out. Now, so they're giving all these reports, just as they did with Mr. Whittington or whatever his name was in Texas, and you would have had the impression he was playing tennis, singles rather than doubles at the hospital. And the first outsider to see him was Tip O'Neill, who was invited to come see him. And Tip bought a book of Irish jokes, and he walked into the hospital, walked in the room, and saw a dying old man. And he backed out of the room and was shocked because he had been watching television with everybody else and thought Reagan would be fine. And when he got back to the Hill, the Capitol Hill, he told Jim Wright, then the number 2 Democrat in the House, we will never be able to really attack this man again if he recovers from this, the courage of it all, etc. And Poland was the issue of the day, really, then, March 30th. Of 1981 and the beginnings of solidarity. And Lech Walesa gave his first full televised speech about a week after Reagan was shot. And it was shown worldwide on television. And the White House talked a lot about Reagan's reaction and what this all meant, et cetera, et cetera. And a young doctor at GW walked by Reagan's room during the Walesa speech, and the president was watching cartoons all by himself in this room. I think actually he might have. On the one hand, you have this legendary. He's now a hero, a genuine hero, not a movie hero. He's a genuine hero to the country. On the other hand, despite the fact that he was built like an ox and was in wonderful shape, Ronald Reagan was never the same again after the shooting, and it was well hidden, but he never had spontaneous contact with any citizenry after that day. He was always in an armored car. They had armored a big Lincoln, which is on display now at the Reagan library, and he never worked defense or walked among strangers, except in the Soviet Union, ironically, after that date. And his energy never fully returned.
So if it hadn't happened, would he have would the tax cuts, would the budget battles of '81, would they have gone differently? Would he have had to compromise?
Well, he was perfectly willing to compromise when he had to, but I think he would have prevailed. Yeah. There was such a difference between the way Reagan worked and the way this kind of mini Reagan we have now. I mean, I would argue seriously that Reagan is still president, as Roosevelt was president for years and years after he died. But Reagan governed by telephone in terms of the Congress. He would, each day, there'd be a green stack of slips about members of Congress, principally conservative Democrats they were trying to win over. And they would have the guy's wife's name or the woman's husband's name, the children, what was on their mind. And Reagan would call and chat them up for a couple of minutes. He talked to more members of Congress in his first 30 days in office than Jimmy Carter did in his entire term. He had learned from the California legislature. And basically what he was telling those people, and what he continued to tell them over all the years. I mean, first it was tax and budget, then it was the Contras, then it was SDI, it was the MX missile. There was one congressional crisis after another, almost all of which he won. And the weapon he used to win was Southern Democrats, or what later be called conservative Democrats, later called Reagan Democrats. And basically what he was telling them was, if you vote with me, I won't campaign against you. The shooting had, and when he approached hero status, that helped a great deal. But his idea was, I'll preserve you and we'll make a deal and we'll work together. We now have a leadership where the theory is we'll crush you, so we can put Tom DeLay being an example and the redistricting of Texas. We're going to destroy you, so we can put a Republican in there. That wasn't what Reagan's congressional agenda was. It was to get Democrats to vote with him.
You made a reference a few minutes ago to the incumbent being a mini Reagan. Is there a sense in which George W. Bush, while he is biologically George H.W. Bush's son, is the political son of Ronald Reagan?
I think he is the political. Bill Keller of the New York Times argued that he was the political son, and he certainly was in the sense that the timing of events in the Bush White House, particularly with the first tax cut, were taken day to day from the Reagan push for his tax cuts. But I think, without using the word, now George Bush has no known father, with the possible exception of the British Colonial Office in the 19th century. I mean, Ronald Reagan, I argue in this book, Ronald Reagan understood the presidency and understood leadership, understood that the job is not managing the government, the job is leading the nation, and that words are more often than not more important than deeds. So that Reagan, faced with the situation that Bush is faced with now in Lebanon, rather than Iraq, cut and ran. He talked big talk, but he redeployed, the new word again, he redeployed the Marines onto ships in the Mediterranean. No, we're just moving them a little bit, because they were in an impossible position at the Beirut airport, which was his fault, and he was primarily responsible for the death of the 241 Marines who died there. But he cut and ran every chance he got, and I would argue so would any sensible president. But we don't have a sensible president at the moment, I would also argue. I didn't do that for the... he governed quite... I mean, Bush is off on his own in what I would call his own ignorance of history. Ronald Reagan was not ignorant of history. He may have imagined a history that that had to do with Shining City on the Hill and Tom Sawyer and Last Best Hope, and imagined a future which had to do with no taxes and no communists. That's why the subtitle of the book. But he did live. He did come from the middle of the country. He did live through the Depression. He did live through World War II. And he did have a sense of history. You couldn't avoid it if you were of his generation. And I would say George Bush, who wanted to be his kind of political son, has no sense of history, including the history of what Ronald Reagan was.
You mentioned the subtitle of the book, and for those who aren't aware of it, it's The Triumph of Imagination. That cuts both ways.
Well, imagination rather than vision, because, one, it cuts both ways in a couple of ways. One is imagination also works backwards. So he imagined the past, he imagined a future, and he generally got us to believe it and buy into it. He also, I don't know if this is what you remember, he is the godfather of the kind of semi-true world that we live in today. He was so gifted at turning issues into emotions that all with kind of a blend of fact and fiction, a blend of reality and entertainment. He turned politics into a subset of his old business. And when I wrote about John Kennedy, I said that the thing you had to remember about him was that he was unwilling to wait his turn. He thought he would die young, but Kennedy wouldn't wait his turn, and now no one does. Reagan mixed truth, fact, fiction, reality, entertainment into this kind of fog of America that I would argue we live in now. No one knows anymore quite what's true. And Reagan was a man who created his own truth to serve his own political ends.
Was that inevitable?
Which part of inevitable?
In the book you say in so many words, he made politics and governing too into a branch of his old business, entertainment. Is that transformation, was that inevitable, or was it a product of Reagan, or he just speeded it up a lot?
Well, you can answer part of the question. A lot of it has to do with movies. I mean, it has a great deal to do. You know, when people talk about Reagan and distance and all of that, you have to remember that literally we all met Ronald. Most of the people in this audience met Ronald Reagan when he was 50 feet high on a screen far from us. That was the distance between him and us, and he managed to maintain that effectively as a politician. I never encountered the question you asked. I think that the communications revolution, the rise of new forms of communication may well have made inevitable this kind of demi-monde of truth that we now live in, that those media may be so powerful that whether Ronald Reagan existed or not, the same kind of things would have begun to happen.
And is there also an argument to be made that it's not altogether a bad thing? If you can stir people, if you can reach truths that statistics and factual analyses can't, maybe there's something to be said for it.
Well, it's a wonderful tool of leadership,
yeah.
and Reagan was a great leader. I didn't want to go where he was taking us, but there's no question he was a great leader, partly because he had mastered and understood those things long before any of us did. And when I say he understood them and talk about this is, many people may know the famous anecdote that Reagan loved to tell about announcing Chicago Cubs baseball games for the WHO in Des Moines, and the telegraph wire breaking while Billy Jervis, who was a Cubs, I guess he was the shortstop, was up, and there was no information coming in. And Ronald Reagan had him hit, who had no idea what was happening in Chicago. He was sitting in a studio in Des Moines, had him hit 37 straight foul balls, hoping the wire would come back up. But Ronald Reagan, again and again during his presidency, would take these kind of nostalgia tours back to Dixon, Illinois, back to Des Moines, the places he had been. And there's almost an unbelievable conversation, well, it is believable, conversation between him and, ironically, the man who succeeded him as sports director of WHO, were still alive and working in the 1980s when Reagan revisited the station. And they did a half hour on the station, and Reagan talked about that incident, and he said, totally without artifice, said that, well, of course he couldn't announce the wire had broke because people would listen to another station. They would turn off and listen to another station. And then when the wire came back on, he couldn't admit what had happened because then everyone would have known he was lying. So, and he lays his, so it's not like the man didn't know what he was doing. If he was a great communicator, it was partly because he understood things that Marshall McLuhan and others came to understand.
Well, he just had such an intuitive grasp of so many things. On the one hand, As you say,
I think part of that was being old.
yeah. Would you have felt that 20 years ago?
What?
Would you have felt that 20 years ago?
This book. It took me 20 years to write these 3 books. If I had ever, for any reason, done Reagan first, I never would have understood the way he worked, because I'm the age now that he was when he first ran for president. And there is a certain wisdom that comes with age. So do a lot of other things that hurt. But
Well, if you were doing the Kennedy and Nixon books now, how would you do them differently? What have you gained in the intervening period of time, do you think, if anything?
I feel pretty good about the Kennedy and Nixon books. I had always hoped that, and I'm convinced someday it will, that proof would come out about something I talked about with Kennedy, which was perfectly clear, but a lot of people are not comfortable with it. That is, he knew in advance that the Berlin Wall was going up and wanted it to go up, and in fact that the Berlin Wall prevented a war. The war, if we ever went to war with the Soviet Union, it wouldn't have been over Cuba, it would have been over Berlin, and that's where it would have begun. And I wait for the day the piece of paper, I mean, I have no doubt, because I know what Kennedy read. It was the front, there was an issue of the old Reporter, the magazine The Reporter, which talked in specific terms about the wall that the Germans, East Germans, wanted to put up, and at that time the Russians were trying to prevent them. And Reagan and Kennedy read that, but all in all, and total serendipity, total luck, I wrote about them all when I was about their age, and I think that I have not. Have I been surprised by anything? I haven't been surprised by anything that's come out on Kennedy or Nixon since I wrote those books. We should ask. I'm having dinner tomorrow night with David Eisenhower, who I met here first, and Julie Nixon Eisenhower, and maybe they'll tell me what I missed in the Nixon book. They wouldn't tell me the first time around.
Well, it is at the Kennedy Library that we're having this discussion. Can you talk a bit about Reagan's view of Kennedy?
Reagan thought that Kennedy was a lightweight. Reagan obviously adored Roosevelt, and he didn't like the Kennedys. He spent a lot of time, by the way, talking to Nixon. Nixon was his principal foreign affairs advisor, which comes out in this book. But he didn't think much of the Kennedys, and I traveled with Robert Kennedy. He was my beat for a time at the New York Times, and I don't know if other people remember this, but there was a debate in 1967, early in 1967, between Ronald Reagan and Robert Kennedy. It was done by satellite, and it was worldwide, and the questions came from young people all around the globe. It was one of the first great television experiments, and I was there with Robert Kennedy, and Reagan just cleaned his clock. I mean, and I remember walking out of the studio, and Kennedy saying to someone, "Who the hell's idea was this? Don't get me alone with this guy again." But I think it had that effect on Bob Kennedy, and I think it had the opposite effect on Ronald Reagan, who thought these guys are, in his mind, are not as smart as I thought they'd be.
You say in the book that this is the end of the trilogy, but if you were to do a similar study of President Clinton and one of the present President Bush, what would the subtitles be?
It gives me a chance to go back. The working subtitle of this book, which we could never use, was President Reagan, based on a true story. Simon and Schuster had the same reaction as everyone here, but that lasted about 20 seconds, and someone said, we want people who like Reagan to buy this book. If I did Clinton, I'm pretty clear on what the subtitle would be, and it's the reason I wouldn't do a book. It would be President Clinton, nothing happened. Presidents are creatures of events, and in a very real way, nothing happened while Bill Clinton was president. I thought his destiny would be to institutionalize the Rooseveltian and semi-Johnsonian welfare state, which meant, by that I mean national health care, and he blew that out of the box, to coin a phrase, and so I don't think there was. With George Bush, I would say it'd probably be George W. Bush, the end of superpower, in the sense that the beginning of the Bush administration, this Bush administration, it was the one superpower world, not only militarily, but economically, morally. The United States was, at the end of the Clinton years, really at a kind of peak. Not that Clinton will get the credit for it, even for me, but and when, by the time George Bush finishes, that will no longer be true. We will be in hock to the other superpower, which will be China. We have destroyed the moral heft that we wanted to. We worked so hard to build up after Vietnam. These people just threw away, and they are the worst thing in many ways about Reagan that they have adopted is the whole idea that our grandchildren will pay our bills for us. Ronald Reagan, a man who made a career of attacking tax and spend Democrats, then invented borrow and spend Republicans, and that's what we're being governed by. And both the trade deficits and the operating deficits that we have, most of us are not going to live to see what the effect of that is. Whether the economy will grow enough that they won't take down the economy of the country, I don't think we're going to live to find out, because they push those bills so far out. But that, I know this is a political opinion. It's not like I try to avoid my political opinions when I wrote about Reagan, but George Bush is going to be right up there or down there with James Buchanan as the worst presidents in American history. I mean, he had, I didn't say that for, it just seems to me he's a terrible president, repeating mistakes that have been made over and over again by people through history, and he seems to be totally unaware of that.
How do you think Reagan, had he been in office, would have responded to 9/11?
I think Reagan, you got to remember that Reagan always, whatever happened bad to us, bad things happen to good people, Reagan immediately was on television that night saying what an outrage it was, and what we were going to do about it, and they'd never forget it. Well, they may never have forgotten it, but we did, because he rarely responded to anything. And, I mean, he gave Cut and Run a good name, and I think it deserves a good name, and I don't think that he ever would have been fool enough. Ronald Reagan was a very cautious man. He understood he made mistakes. He understood how far you could go verbally and get away with it. Sometimes he went too far. But this is when, after the 241 Marines, Ronald Reagan, the reason I say Ronald Reagan caused their deaths was our Marines in Beirut in 1982 it's instructive to remember we went in there after the Israelis, under the defense minister Ariel Sharon, invaded Lebanon to try to wipe out the PLO, and the Israelis were there for 22 years. It took them 22 years to get out, about what it took us to get out of Iraq. The United States became part of the Israelis were literally leveling Beirut, or at least the Muslim sections of Beirut, and the United States, Italy, and France became a multinational force to try to separate the Israelis from the Muslims. That's what they were doing. That was the mandate. And Reagan, in a reckless moment, and he often had them rhetorically, in a press conference, said that we were there to train, these things never end, to train the Lebanese army so that they could pacify their own country. But of course the Lebanese army meant Christians. The Lebanese army was a Christian army, and from that moment on, with Iran, with some help from Iran, the Shiites of Beirut, who surrounded us, concluded the United States is our enemy. And that led to the truck bombing that killed all the Marines. In the period immediately after that, I'm sure all of you recall, we invaded Grenada. But the decision to go into Grenada had been made before the bombing, despite what's been written in a lot of Reagan books. It was the Marine amphibious team, 2 ships, were on their way to Beirut to relieve and help redeploy the Marines who were there. And before, forget the redeploy, before that, we had been watching, had a lot of aerial photos on Grenada and whatnot. Reagan was absolutely convinced, probably wrongly, that it was about to become a Soviet satellite. He ordered one of those, when Maurice Bishop, the kind of friendly Marxist leader, as opposed to unfriendly Marxist leader of Grenada, was killed. He was a communist, and other communists killed him to take power. Reagan decided, the famous medical students were there, and they were a pretext for invading that island. And Reagan wanted to do that. Reagan loved low-risk military situations, as he should, as a president should. And in the final meeting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Reagan seemed dozed off during the meeting. Well, I've been in meetings with the military. I wouldn't mind a little nap either, but the dozed off was obviously not paying attention to most of it, and the chiefs were burning mad. And they got up to leave after a little more than an hour of briefing, which Reagan clearly had not absorbed or heard much of. And as they were leaving, Reagan said to John Vesey, who was the Army Chief of Staff and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, "Jack, come back here a minute." And Vesey came back. He said, "How many people did you say you were going to send in there?" And Vesey said, "It'll take us about 1,000, 1,100 or so, Mr. President." And Reagan said, "Double it." And Vesey said, "But, Mr. President, we don't have to double it. Why should we double it?" And Reagan said, "If you double the number of helicopters in Desert One, you'd be giving this briefing to Jimmy Carter instead of to me. Double it." So he understood America's military strategy has always been to overwhelm, outproduce, outmanufacture, outman the opposition. And Reagan understood that very well. The clown prince of the world, Don Rumsfeld, doesn't understand that. We don't have enough, we never had it. We shouldn't have gone into it. This is a different subject. We shouldn't have gone into Iraq, but if we did, we should have gone in there with enough people, etc. Reagan never would have, he would have said double it, and they would have doubled it.
I'm just going to ask a couple more questions, and then if members of the audience would like to ask questions, there are some microphones, or at least one microphone I can see, strategically placed. So if anyone wants to start going to the mic to ask questions, I'll call on you in a few minutes.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah. Theodore Draper, the political writer, argued that Iran-Contra, from a constitutional standpoint, was far more serious than Watergate. A, would you agree? And B, why has it seemed to go down the memory hole? What's Iran-Contra? I mean, who remembers it?
Yes, I think it was more serious. Certainly broke more laws, and you didn't ask, but the third, yes, Reagan knew, and it's what he wanted to do, and he had the people who were privately financing the Contras in the Oval Office, and he didn't send the Bible to Rafsanjani because he thought Rafsanjani had nothing to read. They were never able to, I'm quoting a man who's dead, but it was a friend of mine. Iran-Contra was so bad that, and the fact of, it was a coup against our own government, really. I mean, it was military action. We're doing a little bit now. That was not known to the public nor approved by the Congress or by anybody else. And Reagan wanted it that way, and he thought he could get away with it, and so broke long series of laws in doing it. Two things happened, I think, three things happened that took it down the memory hole. One is it was always complicated to explain. You could never get a single word like burglary to it. Two, the establishment, this is where I would quote my late friend Arthur Lyman, who became the special counsel to the Senate Investigating Committee of Iran-Contra. People like him, people like Howard Baker, other people of consequence in the country. Arthur Lyman was a Democrat and a great lawyer. Felt that it was in the national interest to have this go away as soon as possible. And they did not want to lay out the full facts. I mean, there was something of an establishment conspiracy to get this thing over with. And finally, Reagan was a good enough actor to do his Alzheimer's number years before he had Alzheimer's. If you read the text of the interviews with him, and managed to confuse the issue almost beyond belief, and then go on television and say, see, there was nothing there, let's all go home, and we did.
Why did the likes of Lyman and Baker want it to go away? Was it too soon after Watergate? Or?
No, I don't think it was because it was too soon after Watergate. It went to the it went too deep into how national security was really being practiced in the country. The best thing to compare it with in many ways, although they did a better job in 1975, was the efforts the United States always makes to cloud the issue of whether we actually assassinate people, whether we were trying to assassinate Castro or the guy in Chile, Allende, and others, Trujillo. It was getting too close to the bone of how of the American national security and intelligence and covert action apparatus that came out of World War II and grew and grew and grew, and particularly grew under Reagan. And I think that these people thought it was too dangerous for the American people to know that. literally, this is what Arthur Lyman told me when as he was leaving for Washington. Well, we were friends, and it was a private conversation, but what is your job? My job is to get this over with as soon as possible.
You had personal experience of both Reagan and Nixon, though not Kennedy. Could you talk, as my final question, would you talk a little bit about what they were like in the same room, how you responded to them as people?
There couldn't be two men more different than Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, although, as I mentioned, they got along, and Nixon was quite important in the Reagan administration, and that was very well hidden from public view. If you looked at Reagan's telephone logs, his telephone calls would last 2 or 3 minutes. He'd tell a joke, he'd ask about your problem, he'd get your vote, and he'd tell another joke, and he was gone. But if you look down and just look down the numbers, and if you see 19, 38, 41 length of phone calls, it was always Nixon that he was talking to, and it was always just before something happened, like Grenada. I met Richard Nixon first. Richard Nixon and I got along. Most reporters are desperately curious introverts, and what we do for a living gives us a kind of cloak in which we can act the way we want to, though most of us, I think, could not, are the kind of people who sit and stand in the corner at the party. Nixon obviously was introverted well beyond that. And I first met him in 1965, talked to him a lot, mainly because I did a book on Alexis de Tocqueville's travels, and Tocqueville had interviewed John Quincy Adams, an embittered former president, and in my book I was repeating the process. I had an embittered former president right there on hand. I'll tell a story about how I left Nixon and how I found Reagan, as it were. The last time I talked to Richard Nixon, his offices were in New York City. He was so awkward. He was so smart and so awkward that it could never be a pleasure talking to him. You were so nervous, not for yourself, but for him. What would happen next? In a particular conversation we had about the Contras, actually, the government had given him a big office in the Federal Building, the Javits Building in New York City, on Federal Square down there by the courthouse, and he was on an upper floor in what had been storage space. There were huge steel doors that rolled open, and inside was a huge rectangular room with 2 Secret Service agents sitting outside. It must have been the worst duty in the history of the service. And it was laid out exactly the same as Nixon's Oval Office had. The couches, the flags, except it was vertical, except it was rectangular, and the view was of water towers, water tanks, and roofs across the warehouse district of New York City. And so we talked an hour and a half. Nixon would talk for long periods of time and usually had interesting things to say. And then we got up and we walked exactly toward where the door is in the Oval Office before you come to the Secretary's office, the Rosemary Woods office. And he opened the door for me and we both walked through it into the stationery closet. So now I'm in the stationery closet with the former President of the United States, and we both, it was a great scene. I was ahead of him because he had, after you, we both it was like a bad movie. We both backed out like it hadn't happened, and then went over to where the door really was. Ronald Reagan, the first time I met him in 1967. I met him in December of 1967, maybe November, and there was great talk then of a Republican dream ticket of Rockefeller and Reagan. And Rockefeller dispatched John Lindsay, then the Republican mayor of New York, out to talk to Reagan about this. And I was then the City Hall bureau chief of the New York Times. And wherever Reagan went, I went. Wherever Lindsay went, I went. And John Lindsay and I were walking down this long corridor of the Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles to the presidential suite, which was a big double door. And as we got there, Lindsay raised his hand to knock on the door, and the door popped open, and there was Ronald Reagan, who was, as always, bigger than you thought he was. And he had obviously been looking through the keyhole, or somebody had, and popped open the door, and he said, "Mr. Mayor, I'm so glad to meet you because I've always wanted to ask a question of a real New Yorker." And Reagan said, Lindsay said, "What's that?" And he said, "Have you ever been to the top of the Empire State Building?" And so Reagan, I have a number of stories about this, and I'm not going to tell any more, but Reagan saw his job as to make you comfortable. It's why people were so comfortable around him, even if he was as far away as the movie screen. And that was his little bit. It didn't make John Lindsay or me either comfortable, but that's what he meant to do. And they just were kind of different men. Before the questions start, can I say just, I should have said at the beginning, what I tried to do in these books, and I'm a journalist, not a historian, although I'm proud, I think the great historians of this generation are in fact journalists. People like David McCullough and Tony Lucas and David Halberstam. It's a great, most of the best history has been done in our time, I think, is narrative and has been done by journalists. After covering the White House and knowing something about it, but certainly not enough. I mean, but you can't come out to television and say, well, Mike, what's going on in there? How the hell would I know? I mean, which is the real answer, but you can't do that. But I did realize that the lives of presidents are so well recorded. That is, every phone call they make, there's something on it. Everything they say, someone notes. Some of the stuff gets classified, some of it's upstairs, sealed in boxes yet. But and everybody who meets a president is usually the high point of their life, and everybody takes notes, and there's a little Rashomon, but they remember what happened. I felt that it was possible, with all of that information, for a writer to put himself in the president's place and to write history, as it were, forward, knowing only what the president knows, knowing that on the day that Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech, that Kennedy, who had never allowed himself to be photographed with King because he really wasn't sure, J. Edgar Hoover was telling him he was a commie, and then he sees him on television giving that speech. He knows he's a star, and John Kennedy liked stars like himself, and said, have him come down. In the 20 minutes, King came to the White House to be photographed with the president for the first time, and talked to the president really for the first time. He signed at an NSC meeting. Kennedy signed off on the overthrow of the GM government in Saigon, which was done with American money and American weapons. And he did that because he had finally been persuaded that GM could not really govern. He had the wrong guy in there. Kennedy tended to believe if things were going wrong, it meant you had the wrong guy there. Kind of FEMA mentality. But he had no idea that he was starting a war in which hundreds of thousands of people would die. He thought he was just changing ambassadors or regents, as it were. So that's the way, at least I find, over these 20 years, history to be. traditional historians, the academic historians, who obviously many of them are great, tend to clean it up. History cleans up what happened. And even no matter how much information is used and whatnot, if you classify the information by theories or by category, economics, war, race, whatever, it makes it all seem logical and as if the president knew what they were doing, and never gets across the point that all these things happen at the same time. And there's just one person, only 43 know what it's like in there trying to deal with it all. So that I should have said that, but that's what I try to do in these books.
Well, in fact, that's a question I meant to ask. Could you do it backwards? Could you do a similar, or someone taking this methodology do a similar book for FDR or Lincoln?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, you could do it for FDR. I don't know enough about what you need. Archives. I mean, and I don't know what the Lincoln archives are, although the archivist is a hell of a writer. Richard, the director of that library, Richard Norton Smith. But I don't know what records existed, and of course, tapes didn't exist. I don't know how far back you could do it. I suspect with Roosevelt you could do it.
Well, let's take some questions from the audience. I see that there's a person already at the microphone. Sir, do you have a question for Dick Reeves?
Mr. Reeves, thank you first for legitimizing getting older. I do appreciate that.
Legitimizing getting older.
Oh, right. Yeah. Like we have a choice.
Mr.
Right.
Reeves, Mr. Reeves, it's the other microphone that's speaking. Thank you.
Oh, I see. The lights are very bright up here. Sorry.
When 43...
I wondered why, because the fellow over here is a little bit younger, right?
Ventriloquism.
When 43 was elected, I had the idea in sort of recompense for the indignity that was given to us that he might listen to 41 and his cadre of advisors other than the incumbents that we see with him. Has that played out for good or for ill?
Well, I would have hoped the same thing, and I think it's played out for ill. And I think that beneath the surface, it was interesting, we talked about the child of Reagan thing. I think there's great anger of the son against his father in that relationship. I always felt, again, talking about archives, they're pretty stingy, to say the least, up at the Reagan Library and also with 41's papers in Houston. And the conventional wisdom is that's because George Bush is trying to protect his father and his father in history. My own reading, and I don't have any degrees in psychology or psychiatry, is that George Bush's real drive is to be kind, to outdo his father. The father succeeded at everything he did in life up to the presidency, and then was at best a mediocre president. The son failed at everything he did in life until he became president, and obviously sees himself as a successful president, outstripping his father. And I think that's his motivation, and it's a shame, but he doesn't seem to listen to anybody.
This gentleman here.
First of all, I'd just like to thank you for opening a window to all of us into the presidency. I think it's great that you came down. I have one question of Kennedy and one question of Nixon. One is, who do you think killed President Kennedy? And two is, what do you think of Richard Nixon? That I think he was one of the original architects of national health care. And what do you think about it?
One, on the question of, I accept most of the conventional wisdom on the killing of John Kennedy, although I think that he set the stage for his own demise. That is, although it's regularly denied, we were out there trying to kill leaders we didn't like, and particularly Castro. And people in organizations like Fair Play for Cuba and whatnot, there was a whole community of people, most of them sane, who disagreed with Kennedy's obsession, both Kennedys' obsession with Castro. And it seems to me perfectly logical or possible that out of that atmosphere of people that this became their lives, someone crazy enough to try to take care of it would emerge. And Oswald, to me, fits that description. And all the things I've seen over the years have not changed that. Richard Nixon and healthcare. Richard Nixon, of course, also introduced and got passed the first real environmental laws, et cetera, et cetera. Richard Nixon, to quote him, did not give a shit about domestic affairs. He had great architectural mind, and he cared about kind of bouncing nations around with Kissinger to make it work. And that national health care, along with the environmental laws, were things he signed off on practically without looking at. They were done. The environmental laws were all an attempt to attack Ed Muskie, who he thought would be his opponent in 1972. So that sheen of liberalism over the Nixon administration, to me, was just to hold the other side at bay. As Nixon once said to somebody, "I didn't come here to build outhouses in Peoria." That's what he thought of domestic policy. He didn't care as long as it didn't interfere with his notions of creating a brave new world and also of creating a different kind of government. He was not much on checks and balances either.
Over here. Over here.
Thank you for this. Getting back to when President Reagan was shot, I remember the next day in the paper, the Globe, it said that when he was admitted, he said, "I should have zigged instead of zagging." And then he was checking out the surgeons, whether they were Republicans or Democrats. Was he being full of jokes right out of the gate, or was he up to all that?
Well, all that happened.
Did.
And he woke up, and when he came to, I mentioned he collapsed and he was unconscious. When he came to on the gurney going into the operating room, his hand was being held by a nurse named Mize, who was also checking his pulse. They couldn't find his pulse for a while. And he opened his eyes and said, "Does Nancy know about this?" So he had this wonderful catalog of mine, all those things he said, and he had an assistant named Lynn Nofziger, who came from California, who was a very sloppy, very likable, sloppy guy, quite un-Republican in his everything but his political views, and who had a pad and was writing down these things, as Reagan said them, and stuffing them into his pockets. And after one of the press conferences, a reporter said, did the president say anything? And Nofziger said, "Oh, I forgot." And then he pulled out this pile of kind of folded and crumpled paper and read these things off one after another. But none of that was faked. And it added a lot to, all in all, I'd rather be in Philadelphia. Honey, I forgot to duck. All added up to, grace under pressure.
Thank you.
Over here.
Good afternoon. Would you please revisit the assassination and your opinion on what would have occurred if Hinckley had been successful and Reagan had died?
If Reagan had died, I think that the arc of Reagan's presidency is extraordinarily interesting. And as he comes to a peak with the taxes, then he begins a decline through Iran-Contra. And after Iran-Contra, he was almost alone. I mean, his advisors, the press didn't like him. Liberals obviously didn't like him. The conservatives thought he was selling out the country. And it came down to, really, Reagan had one fixed idea his entire life, which was that communism would collapse of its own weight. And in his 7th and 8th years of office, a Soviet leader emerged who believed the same thing. And so that suddenly you have the climax, really, of this presidency, and the reason it ends well is that these two men come to first kind of like each other and then trust each other. This is the first book that has the transcripts of their conversations, and then depend on each other. One guy's trying to save his presidency and his ideology, and the other guy's trying to save his ideology and his country. So that these two people, really alone in a political sense of the word, cut this deal that ends or brings almost 10 years and a month after Reagan was inaugurated. The Warsaw Pact dissolved and its members applied for membership in NATO. You had to have some imagination to think that was going to happen in 10 years. If Reagan had been killed, even if the other events had happened, unrest in Eastern Europe, failing economy in the Soviet Union, Gorbachev becoming leader, George H.W. Bush, who would have then been president probably, thought he was of the school, as were most of the people in the White House, that this was another dirty commie trick. And I don't think ever could have. Reagan was probably unique in being able to work out that deal. In the Cold War, if he had died then, probably would have continued. It would have ended, and we would have prevailed, but it wouldn't have ended then, and conceivably it could still be going on now. So this is all conjecture, obviously, but I don't think George Bush would have trusted the father. I don't think he trusted the Russians enough to do what Reagan did. And Reagan, when I say he was bold and a gambler, it was a hell of a gamble.
Well, you were saying earlier how in many ways he was conservative, but when he gambled, it paid off.
Well, he was, yes,
yeah.
In that instance.
Yeah, he knew not to cut and run that.
Now, he gambled on supply-side economics, and we still don't know how that will end, because the bills haven't come due yet.
Over here.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for being such a great witness. I got two questions. One is about JFK and one about Nixon first. And the first one is about the Catholic issue concerning JFK's being the first Catholic president of the United States. And the second one, so I'd like to know how you would like to define the Catholic issue according to JFK. And the second question concerns Nixon and Kissinger's politics. Would you define it a strategy or just a technique?
A critique?
Technique.
Technique. I got lost. The first question was?
The Catholic issue.
Oh, my own feeling, and I write this in the Kennedy book, is that the Catholic issue was not settled in that election or settled in Houston at a meeting of evangelical preachers. I think World War II was what settled the Catholic issue, but it just didn't happen. But if you look back at, I think you and I once talked about this. If you look back at the propaganda movies, the World War II movies, John Wayne and all that, what the underlying theme in those movies, with Bill Bendix playing the guy from Brooklyn and Richard Conte playing the Italian guy from Jersey City, which is where I'm from, what those movies were about was suddenly we were facing, it was a Protestant country, And Catholics were pretty actively discriminated against up until World War II. Suddenly we had this all-out national effort, and we need everybody. And all those movies are of the theme, we're all in this together, we're all Americans. And I think it was that national mobilization, which the films reflected, that took 30% of the population. At the beginning of World War II, 30% of Americans were Catholics. And to fight that war, they had to be brought into the commonweal, or else. And I think that after that, the Catholic issue, yes, in some parts of the country, et cetera, Christ in some parts probably still is. But it's also, I think, while I'm at it, the Jewish, the black, the woman thing have all been settled. It's just a question of the circumstances now and of the right candidate coming along. Kennedy happened to be the right candidate to be the first Catholic president. Nixon and Kissinger, was it all technique? I didn't understand that.
Was it more of a strategy or technique, their geopolitics?
Oh, the geopolitics. Nixon was the senior partner by far in his relationship with Kissinger. Kissinger happens to be a better writer and could get books out faster about how, and then I told the president. But Richard Nixon had a wonderful architectural mind. Other ways it was quite different. But Herb Klein, his press secretary, once said of him, he can see a cloud there, feel a raindrop over here, and say there's going to be a flood in Bangladesh next year. And there was some of that. I know from my own conversations, and in the Nixon book, they tend to be something, I don't know if they're actually a footnote, but they're played down because, again, I'm trying to stay in place in time. Richard Nixon told me that he thought the job of a president of the United States, that a war between the East and West, with the West led by the United States, the East led by China, was inevitable. It might be a shooting war, it might be an economic war, but their interests were fundamentally different over the long term, and eventually they would clash. And the job of the leaders of the West were to prevent that from happening, or prevent that for as long as possible, because he believed, Nixon, that the East would win that confrontation. That is strategic thinking, I think. Reagan and Kissinger was his helpmate. He certainly had the intellect to stay with him and to understand and to fill in some blanks and whatnot. But in truth, it was Nixon's strategy. After the 1976 Republican convention, when Reagan almost beat Jerry Ford, the Republican Party, and Ford then lost to Carter, realized that Reagan would probably be their next nominee, and many of them thought he was a dolt. And they set up a series of briefings for him on national issues. The communism briefing was done by Richard Allen of Notre Dame, who later became his national security advisor. Allen talked for a couple of hours in Pacific Palisades. Reagan didn't say much. He never said much in meetings like that. And at the end stood up and said, I appreciate what you've told me. And what Allen basically said was, the country expects a candidate to have a strategy for dealing with communism in the Soviet Union, and no one can be elected president unless they do. And here's the strategy. He talked a lot about containment, détente, more containment than détente in Allen's thing. And Reagan said at the end, I appreciate very much you're taking the time to do this, and you may not consider one, but I do have a strategy, Dr. Allen. And Allen said, what is that? And Reagan said, we win, they lose.
Over here.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the personal interaction between Reagan and Gorbachev.
The personal interaction? Considering that obviously neither of them could speak the languages, what happened between Reagan and Gorbachev, and we may never see their like again. When you read the transcripts of what they said, obviously they were both political leaders trying to solve their own political problems first. But when the Reykjavik summit, which was considered a failure at the time, and they tried to put a spin on it. But what happened in Reykjavik was the thing got totally out of control. Only the room that they were meeting in was the size of the stage, and there were only 6 people in the room. Each had one advisor and two. There were 2 translators in there. And when they went at it, Jack Matlock, who was the American assistant for Reagan and later became ambassador to the Soviet Union, said what happened in that room was that each side saw the other side's bottom line for the first time. That it was the first honest conversation between an American leader and a Soviet leader. Both of them admitted their strengths and their weaknesses, their certainties and their doubts. And although they walked out in a huff because Reagan wouldn't give up SDI, and Gorbachev's mission was, at that time, it changed later, to get rid of SDI, the 2 men knew each other and had begun to trust each other. And that comes through in the dialogue. They don't, in the beginning, back in Geneva, they talked to each other as if now you're going to tell me those American lies, or you're going to tell me those Soviet lies. By the end, it was, I never thought about that, but if you put it that way, maybe we can, kind of thing. So it's the most extraordinary dialogue of the late 20th century. It has to be, if not, of the whole century. It's just extraordinary stuff as these 2 men unravel each other, and it's very clear if you read the transcripts who prevails, and it was not the young one.
There's time for just 2 more questions. One from over here, the next one.
Have you ever given any thought to what would have happened if Richard Nixon had narrowly won the presidency in 1960 rather than John Kennedy?
I've not given it a lot of thought, although I think the major thing the major difference between Kennedy winning that election and Nixon not. Nixon was a capable fellow, and he wasn't as crazy then as he later became. That was part of what made him so crazy.
No, that's what I was wondering, yeah.
But the decision that could not, I think, have been postponed. John Kennedy, after the Freedom Riders and the integration of the University of Alabama and that cluster of incidents in 1963, went on television and gave the speech which basically put the government of a democracy on the side of the minority. Lyndon Johnson and other people had helped Kennedy figure out that as long as the Southerners in Congress, white, who ran the Congress, and the black kids in universities for the first time both thought that the president was on their side, the violence would escalate, that the president had to take sides. The president, a great tribute to John Kennedy, I think. John Kennedy got on television and said, this is not a political issue, this is not a regional issue, this is a moral issue, this is a question of what kind of people we are. And if there is equality, I'm paraphrasing, if there is equality in this country, then whom among us would choose to be Negro? Nixon had the confrontation built, and I think it would have gone on the side of the majority. And God then only knows what would have happened afterwards. I think that would have been the biggest difference. In Vietnam and things like that, I think they would have been about the same.
can't resist this comment about Arthur Lyman because Dick Cheney was on that committee, wasn't he? On the Iran-Contra committee that Arthur Lyman was the counsel on. He was.
He was a joint committee then?
Yes.
Yeah.
And he was, Lyman was the counsel, I believe, and Cheney.
I was shocked when Arthur told me that.
Yeah. And it's interesting. Maybe that has got something to do with his attitude toward how he's operating now.
Maybe it didn't work very well.
Well, no, Reagan got away with it.
Yeah, he got away, right.
Yeah.
And he also was the one who privately says Reagan proved deficits don't matter. Not the best influence we've had in the White House.
Last question over here.
I just wondered if you could comment on whether at what point the early stages of his memory loss or Alzheimer's affected any of his decision making, especially in his second term.
Right. I worked on this book with David Owen, Lord Owen, who was the foreign minister of Great Britain and also a physician, who got access to Reagan's medical records and is writing a book about leadership and illness, effective. And what that research showed was that Reagan showed symptoms, there were including brain scans, of early dementia at about 75, in the middle of his presidency. Early dementia is not Alzheimer's, and that the first symptoms of Alzheimer's appeared in 1990, 2 years after he was president. Dementia is a condition. Alzheimer's is a terminal disease. So he did not have Alzheimer's. He had dementia. All of us maybe have a little when you get to a certain age. And it showed often. But I'll tell a final story about the underrating of Reagan by people like me. One of the more famous incidents in the Reagan presidency, because it was on film, he was usually clever enough not to be filmed in embarrassing ways. But when he met with Pope John Paul at the Vatican, and while the Pope was speaking, fell asleep. And that picture has been shown all over the world, et cetera, and will be forever. Before they came outside for that press conference, the Pope and the President were crawling around on the floor together of the Pope's office, going over American satellite intelligence photos of missile placements in Europe. And out of that conversation, the Pope agreed with Reagan's request, which was that he not endorse the nuclear freeze movement and that he punish the archbishops and cardinals, or sanction them, who already had come out. If you remember, the nuclear freeze movement was sweeping the world, particularly Europe. If the Pope had come out on the side of it, which he was originally inclined to, that would have tipped the balance, and the history of the late 20th century would have probably been quite different than it was. But we didn't know that. All we knew was the guy fell asleep. So if nothing else, I learned in doing this book that naps are not a danger to the national security.
Thank you to Dick Reeves.
Thank you.
And I just want to point out that if you'd like to buy a copy of Dick's book and have it signed, they are on sale, and he will be available in the museum shop afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you all. As the Russians say, thank you very much.